The monasteries and convents of Europe were a society in themselves. For the faithful, they offered a life devoted to prayer, meditation, and the search for salvation.
The monastic life was dominated by the rhythm of the 7 hours of the liturgical day, which meant that 7 times in the day monks had to be there in choir, singing and saying parts of the service. And that included getting up in the middle of the night. When you weren't taking part in liturgical services, your life was also rigorously regulated. In many monasteries, speaking was only allowed in certain places and at certain times. All privacy was removed from them. Their food was supposed to be very simple. Monks' clothing was also very hard, harsh, and uncomfortable.
Two weeks after the night in the forest, Luther joined one of the most severe monastic orders in Germany, the Eremite Augustinians of strict observance. His hair was cut. He was clothed in the white robes of the novice monk. And he prostrated himself before the abbot. He had been welcomed into the very heart of the Catholic Church.
It was not the kind of order that you would choose if you wanted a comfortable or easy life. It wasn't that kind of religious house at all. It was, however, I think a good order for someone to join who was also quite spiritually and mentally gifted.
But Luther's new home was as much a business as a spiritual retreat. The abbot was running a thriving trade in dyeing cloth. The monks had a brewery distilling a rather popular beer, while the monastery owned land across the neighborhood, making a tidy income from rent and tithes. All diligently accounted for in the monastery's extensive business records. He threw himself into the isolated, ascetic life of the Church's devoted followers. He soon graduated from the white robe of the novitiate to the black of the confirmed monk, the only piece of clothing he now owned.
He tells us that he wasn't in there for fun or to muck about or to have a good time. That, for example, means, well, just to pick up one feature, it means fasting, it means recurrent fasting, it means really bodily, physical self-denial.
The monk's strict routine of prayer and study was accompanied by a regime of persecution of the flesh. Initiates were encouraged to sleep without coverings or blankets, even to whip themselves.
One of the things they're trying to do is to imitate the sufferings of Christ, to be what is called an ascetic, to believe that by dominating your fleshly desires, by no longer needing food, sexual companionship, the comforts of life, you are identifying yourself with Christ in the wilderness, that you are battling with the forces of evil in yourself by battling with your own lower nature.
Luther threw himself into this regime with fervor, sleeping out in the snow without blankets until his fellow monks dragged him in half dead. In later years, he would complain that these years in the monastery had permanently ruined his health. For 5 years, Luther labored without relief. Then, in 1510, he was offered an escape from his cloistered life. He was sent by his order on a mission to Rome, one of the Church's greatest pilgrimages.
Luther immediately decided he would make the best spiritual use of this trip that he could.
Rome was a treasure trove of holiness, the home of St. Peter's, the Pope, and the remains of countless saints and martyrs. Tens of thousands of pilgrims flocked to Rome every year, all hoping the journey would bring them closer to God.
You dress differently, you take a stick, you walk, you live very modestly. There are little hostels along the routes for pilgrims, so that when you get to the place of pilgrimage, in a way you're in a state of such penance and deservedness that encountering the saint's tomb, which is at the end of the pilgrimage, you'll be worthy to partake in the grace of encountering it.
It took a full 2 months for Luther and his companion to make the long journey south. And then, in October of 1510, they finally arrived at the Eternal City. Luther arrived in Rome just as the Renaissance was reaching its height. Michelangelo was painting the ceilings of the Sistine Chapel. Raphael was hard at work decorating the Pope's private apartments. To the young monk, the city was a revelation.
Luther was a very northern provincial boy. He had lived in, by then, 3 towns in his whole life. So he hadn't seen very much. And to come to the city and to see the retinues of the cardinals and the great palaces and all of this basking in a totally different weather and different foods and smells must have been a terrific shock to the system.
The Church may have taught that money is at the root of all evil, and to lend it at interest, for example, is a mortal sin. But in reality, of course, the Church dealt in millions of ducats.
Luther had entered the headquarters of a Europe-wide corporation, supported on the profits of monasteries such as his own, on the donations of the faithful, and fees that were charged for everything from a wedding license to a cardinalship.
Luther was clearly very disillusioned by Rome, not simply by the spiritual superficiality, but also by the way in which he felt that Rome simply did not reflect Christianity as he understood it.
Luther's trip to Rome had brought only disillusion and doubt. And life in the monastery now offered even less consolation than before. Still desperate to ensure his salvation, Luther spent his life in endless confession, laying bare his soul up to 4 times a day for as long as 6 hours at a time, spending the rest of his days in penance.
And so monasticism was a hell for him. Here he was doing the most important, the best thing you can do that his society said, and it gave him no relief.
It would take the labor and insight of another to help Luther escape this prison of his own anguish, and unwittingly set him on the path to revolution. In